Good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here with you. Can you hear me? I'll speak loudly, and if those of you in the back can't hear me, please make a motion or something so that you can tell me to speak up, okay? It says that I'm the last person speaking. It's been a long set of people talking at you. I'm going to try and equip you with some tools that can maybe be useful in what I think lies ahead as a long-haul struggle. I want to start, though, just by thanking the Up in the Ante editorial committee for all of their work in organizing this event tonight. And I just want to specifically say that I'm really honored to be on this panel with these people that I'm not making this up. Like, these are all people that I have really looked up to for more than a decade, each of them. So thanks for being here. And the other thing I want to do is I want to acknowledge the fact that this event is taking place on the Mississaugas of New Credit Territory. And I understand as well that this is a territory that has served as a meeting site for actually many Indigenous peoples. And I make this acknowledgement not as some kind of piece of rhetoric. I know this can often happen as a kind of like leftist opening of events. But I say this as a way to talk about the ongoing resistance and resilience of Indigenous struggles on this continent. And I think this is going to come into some of what I'm going to talk about in terms of what's been happening inside the nation-state context that I come out of, which is the United States. So as was mentioned in the biography, I'm from Alaska, which is actually not exactly the United States. I grew up on Anchorage, which is traditional Dena'ina territory, and these days I live in Ottawa, which is on, as we said, unceded Algonquin territory. And I've been involved in social justice struggles all up and down the US West Coast. I've only been living in the Canadian context for about 9 years now. And I spent a fair bit of time interviewing people involved in those struggles. And so I'm going to try and bring some of that into what I'm saying tonight. And I have a practice, which is that whenever I speak, particularly when I speak about other people's organizing work, I like to dedicate what I'm going to say to an organization that has significantly shaped how I think about things. So I want to dedicate what I'm going to say tonight to the Rural Organizing Project in Oregon. If you don't know about ROP, you should really look them up, because they've been actually trying to organize the constituencies that I think are often pointed at as electing Donald Trump. And they've been trying to drive a wedge into right-wing organizing of rural communities in the state of Oregon. They've done it really smartly and established some very interesting strategies for talking about racial justice in majority white rural communities. Okay, so I have a lot that I want to do tonight in a very short period of time. But because I'm very literally minded, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do before I do it. First thing I want to do is make a couple of observational points about what's going on in the US. Second is I want to point to some promising areas of struggle that are ongoing in the US and that I think are actually building momentum in the wake of Trump's election. Then I want to try and draw out some points that are relevant to movement building in our context in Canada, because I think it's easy to focus on what's happening in the US and shirk our own responsibilities for the context that we're in right here. And then I want to give you an update on what in Ottawa we're calling the Donald Trump Unwelcoming Committee, our preparations for Trump's likely visit to Ottawa early next year. And I'm going to invite you to come join us. And then I'm going to close with a few, if I have time, a few questions that I think are useful for us to think about as we move ahead into new terrains of struggle. Does it make sense as a plan? Okay. So I'm going to talk in really general and provocative ways because the time is short. And I hope that you can take them in that spirit and we get into some of the nuances as we get into the discussion. You can share some of your own thoughts and observations and questions too. So, points about the US. In this moment of crisis, many people on the left are making all kinds of grand pronouncements about the national character of the United States, about the white working class, and so on. That stuff is really unhelpful and kind of boring, but it's actually the parade that has been social media since the election. I'm not going to talk about that stuff. I want to actually really avoid contributing to that kind of chatter, and instead I want to just highlight 3 quick points by way of observation. The first one is that I think that this election has revealed things that have been in motion in the United States for a very long time. Everybody else on this panel, I think, has spoke to that in some way tonight. Many other people have elaborated on that in other ways that I think are very useful. The one thing I want to say about it is that I think it's very telling that Donald Trump was elected in a moment when there is an insurgent black movement happening, the movement for Black Lives, and that there is a resurgence of Indigenous sovereignty struggles, specifically around Standing Rock, right? So for me, my analysis is that the US was founded on 2 primary dispossessions. Those possessions were the theft of that land for indigenous people, and the second one was the slave trade, right? The forcible removal of African people to the United States to build an economy. And so I think there's really something significant about the fact this election happened when these two foundational sites of dispossession and the struggles around them are fully happening, right? I think actually kind of interesting and exciting. And Angela Davis said recently, this is a time to reflect on the extent to which we are living with the relics and ghosts of slavery. I think we can put this in stronger terms. I think we can say this is now time to recognize the realities of colonialism and white supremacy as ongoing structural arrangements that have shaped the United States and continue to shape the United States. The struggles around those structural arrangements are central. Second observation I want to make, and a lot of people have said this already, David actually posted about it on Facebook recently in a very useful way, and that's just that there's been this unhelpful dichotomy of race and gender on the one side versus class on the other side. These two kind of simplistic ways of trying to make sense of this election. Boring, right? Boring old school left debates there. Not useful. Robin Kelly, who is a wonderful radical historian and who you should check out, you should really read his work, recently wrote a great essay for the Boston Review where I think he summed this up nicely. Quote, "I'm not suggesting that white racism alone explains Trump's victory, nor am I dismissing the white working class's very real economic grievances. It's not a matter of disaffection versus racism or sexism versus fear. Rather, racism, class anxieties, and prevailing gender ideologies operate together, inseparably, or as Kimberly Crenshaw would say, intersectionally." Basic point from women's studies class like 101 right there, that I think we can actually apply to thinking more complexly to what has happened with this election. Third observation is I want to pull out a quote from my friend Angus McGuire, who's a labor and anti-racist activist in Oregon. He recently wrote a very interesting blog post about this moment, and he said, "The problem with Trump is not that he is vulgar, that he looks or talks funny, that he is ignorant, that he is offensive or disgusting. The problem with Trump is that people will die, and lives will be ruined as a result of his vision of the world." Right? So it's not about this doofus guy. It's actually about the people who are going to be tremendously harmed and killed as a result of what he's going to do in this administration. And predictably, the people who are going to take the brunt of that are on the lowest rungs of social hierarchies in the United States and actually everywhere else in the world where the United States has policies that in one way or another affect it. This is like a really terrible picture with very dramatic consequences that has really been hitting me lately, especially as I talk to people around the United States. There's lots more to say in terms of observations about this moment, but I want to turn because what I like to talk about is struggles. And so I want to just highlight a few struggles that I think have been going in useful ways and are actually in some ways blossoming even more now and will be very promising in the years ahead, at least as far as I can tell. I'm going to talk about 6, but I'm basically just going to enumerate them because of time purposes here. The first is sanctuary initiatives and community self-defense. So it's, I think, really worthwhile and interesting that people in all kinds of different institutions right now, including universities and faith communities, are talking about how to convert their institutions into sanctuaries, spaces where people cannot be deported from, or spaces that will not cooperate with immigration authorities. Lots of limitations and critiques to raise around this, but this is a very promising area of work and actually builds on a hidden history of the sanctuary movement in the US during the 1980s that we can talk more about if you want to. Second thing, indigenous-led struggles for climate justice. Right? Standing Rock, I think, has made this really apparent, that this is a key site and really promising. But the fact of the matter is, Standing Rock is just one example of a hotbed of activity that's happening all across this continent right now. And of course, we know a lot about this in the Canadian context. And in some ways, settlers in the United States are still catching up in terms of their own political consciousness about the centrality of indigenous struggles in environmental justice organizing in this moment. But I think this is a key area. The third, as I mentioned earlier, is the movement for Black lives. I think it's amazing that this movement has blossomed in the way that it has not lost, but instead gained momentum with each new person who's been killed by the police in some way. It's actually grown and in some ways started to build organizations and institutions through which people are crafting new strategies and visions. of what it would mean to build a society where Black lives matter. I think it's great to see that so many of those activists are not backing down in the face of the Trump election, right? That's a lot of promise there and a lot of possibility for aligning with that kind of intervention. Historically in the United States, when the Black freedom movement is in motion, other movements blossom and grow as well. Fourth thing, working class self-defense. Some of you may have heard about Solidarity Network style organizations that have been building across the continent. The Seattle Solidarity Network was one of the first to actually take some lessons from the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty and then put them into a kind of easily replicable model that has now been exported into any number of cities. These are people who come together to fight back against landlords, against wage theft, and other ways that working class people are exploited regularly, and to use direct action as a way to do that. I think that's a really promising, although also full of contradictions and challenges kind of struggle that's happening right now. Fifth, Kristen already hit on it, anti-fascist organizing. I think I've been seeing new energy right now for directly confronting white supremacist organizations and fascists in the streets. David talked about North Carolina. That's just one example. This stuff is actually happening all over the place. And I don't actually completely agree with the politics of the website, It's Going Down. But if you want to actually see a lot of reporting on this, it's worth looking at It's Going Down. They're insurrectionist anarchists, and they like to fight fascists, and they like to record other people doing it. And you can find out about what they're doing and actually read the information they're gathering. And the last thing, as I mentioned, is rural organizing. There actually are people, are longstanding organizations in the United States who have been digging in rural communities to try and build anti-racist organizations that are addressing the everyday needs and challenges of rural working class people. So this means actually talking about things like economic injustice and poverty and precarity at the same time as talking about white supremacy and misogyny and heterosexism, right? These are all features of rural life. They're all features of city life as well, but they're different in different kinds of places. You still following me okay here? Okay, so I want to make 4 points that I think are relevant for movement building in the Canadian context. Then I'll tell you about this Donald Trump unwelcoming committee. So the first point is that I think in this period, I actually have thought this for a long time, but I think it's even more the case now, organizations are important, and they're dramatically lacking. We actually don't have many organizations on the left right now. And I really appreciated Hassan from No One Is Illegal wrote this short blog post in September that was about the importance of organizations. I just want to read you a couple sentences that Hassan wrote that I thought were right on. He said, "It may seem that media moments are where change happens, but that is fleeting. Large-scale movements rise up and dissipate. Organizations, collectives, affinity groups are needed to build up to them and beyond them. We need to win immediate material changes in the lives of our global communities and create the conditions where new worlds can be imagined." That's something that organizations of various kinds can do. And yeah, there just aren't that many right now, and I think we ought to start thinking about how do we build those kinds of things? Even on small scales, how do we build those kinds of things? This is something that people in the United States context are really struggling with right now, because there are lots and lots of people, particularly white people, who are suddenly very alarmed about the political direction of the country, and they're looking for ways to plug in. There are not a lot of mass membership organizations that are there readily welcoming people in. I would say one important exception to this is the chapter-based organization Showing Up for Racial Justice, otherwise known as SURGE, which has chapters across the US and actually has been organizing people. There's a lot to learn from SURGE, and to my knowledge, there's only one SURGE chapter in the Canadian context. People have also been organizing emergency community meetings in many US cities and building websites to facilitate those kinds of community meetings. I think that's a good first step. Things we can learn from there, for sure. Second thing, I think the only way forward is through organizing. And when I talk about organizing, I'm talking about something specific. It's not just expressing outrage about the current state of things, and it's not just going to protests. It's about trying to reach outside of comfortable and customary activist communities and build with people, bring people together, and actually build power that is capable of shifting things in society more generally. And part of the way I think about organizing is with this quote from a labor activist in Vermont named Jamie McCullum. Jamie recently wrote an article for Toward Freedom the fundamental organizer nostrum that people are transformed when they are brought through a struggle, not when they are simply offered different facts, interpretations, or empathy, requires action to make it meaningful. Basic point here, people change when they go through struggle together, not when we bombard them with information. And organizing is about working with people to move through struggle and change as part of that struggle. The third thing, and I really appreciated this coming out in what Kristen said, is this is a time for polarization. So a lot of times, particularly on the liberal left, people think about polarization as a bad thing. But I like to think about polarization based on an interview that I conducted with Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, the indigenous historian. It was actually published in Up in the Ante like many, many eons ago. And in this conversation with Roxanne, one of the things she said that really struck me was she said, we have to figure out how to divide the white community. And I was, what are you talking about, Roxanne? What are you talking about? And she said, this means organizing in the white community, or at least dividing it, getting it generationally divided or in some way divided, so that it's not just Indian versus white. Basically what she was saying is, we have to figure out how to break off sections of people who are in some way advantaged and set up opportunities for there to be internal conflicts where people are standing up against each other and actually shutting down the possibility for things like white supremacy to happen. So I say, now is a time for more polarization. Let's bring the polarization. Okay, I'll say one last thing in terms of Canadian context and movement building, and then I want to talk about the Donald Trump Unwelcoming Committee. Last thing is just that this is a time for study and reflection, more than ever, I think. And one form of study and reflection that I think is very helpful is learning about the far right. And the fact of the matter is, this is a moment where suddenly everybody on Facebook has become an expert about the far right, but there are people who've been studying the far right for decades, and we can actually look to their research, their wisdom. There are people who've been organizing against the far right for decades. We can look to their research and wisdom. One person I would point you toward is Matthew Lyons, who runs a blog called Three-Way Fight. And he's been writing brilliant analysis lately around this whole thing related to the alt-right. He actually argues that it's more misogynistic than neo-Nazism, and he has a particular way of talking about how that's an organizing strategy. Okay, let me just say a few words about the Donald Trump Unwelcoming Committee, and then I'll close it up. So, as I mentioned, in Ottawa, we're expecting Trump to show up sometime in early 2017. It's been the tradition for the last couple decades, at least, for an elected president to first visit Canada. And so, we're trying to get ready for this likely eventuality. And as part of that, we've formed DTUC, the Donald Trump Unwelcoming Committee. You can check us out at trumpunwelcoming.org. And we're working to build broad-based mobilization for when Trump comes. And one important aspect of this for us is to not let Trudeau off the hook, right? There's a very easy way to think about Trump as the sort of despicable character in this moment, and Trudeau as the handsome good guy who just wants to shake your hand and have a nice chat, right? But he's doing despicable things right now with that smiley face. And we say, and keep in mind too that he welcomed Trump to come to Canada with open arms as soon as Trump was elected. So we say this is a time to call out both Trump and Trudeau when Trump comes to Ottawa. And we've developed a call to action with our friends in Montreal associated with Solidarity Across Borders. You can go to solidarityacrossborders.org, see the call to action. If you're part of an organization, please sign on to this call for action. You can start organizing here. We're going to invite you to come to Ottawa and shut down Trump. We're very interested in actually disrupting completely whatever he does in terms of his appearance there. And there'll be a regional meeting to start planning some of those protests hosted in Ottawa in January. And you can look at those websites for more information. Of course, we'll be circulating all the announcements about that stuff soon as we start to formulate it. But please come to Ottawa. But as one of my comrades in DTUC says, wear your long johns. Thanks.